guards and state troopers at the border, building border walls, river buoys, all of these things to make the statement that the border is wide open, which is not. But it's causing a lot of harm in our community. So we don't have not only in Texas the militarization of the federal government that we had traditionally had, but also now the new emerging actor of the Texas state also militarizing the border. So I think migrants and border residents are being impacted by those strategies.
Let's go to the border city of Eagle Pass, Texas. That's extended a state of emergency declaration as thousands of asylum seekers have arrived in recent days. This is the Democratic mayor of Eagle Pass, Rolanda Salinas.
What's disappointing is that you have all these thousands of people just walking in without any consequence whatsoever. So the word is getting out. It's kind of a come one, come all type of approach. And you have all these people coming. There is no consequence. And I just want to say that I think that this is unacceptable. It's a shame that we don't have immigration reform and a solution to prevent situations like this.
So I want to reiterate that this mayor of Eagle Pass, Congressmember Garcia, is a Democrat as he attacks the Biden administration and has continued to for the lack of response in the area. So you have the racist policies of the Texas Governor Abbott, where you have this actual razor saws embedded in the buoys and people dying wrapped in razor wire along the river's edge. That is just horrifying. But at the same time, Congressmember Garcia, in Chicago, you have this overall broken policy. What do you think President Biden needs to do right now? What can be done where you are? It's noisy now in the Capitol Rotunda. It may not be in a few days when the government shuts down. But what are you saying to Republican and Democratic colleagues about this?
Well, members of Congress have called on the White House to do the right thing and help get more assistance to affected areas. And this is what we were asking for in the letter to the White House to Secretary Mayorkas. The border cities that are the frontline receivers of a lot of this migration, people in desperation seeking asylum, need more resources. Cities that are receiving and have a welcoming policy like Chicago and New York need additional resources as well. Work permits would go a long ways toward alleviating some of the fiscal strain that these cities at both in the interior, Chicago, New York, as well as border cities are experiencing right now. Additional resources, funding from FEMA for food and shelter would go a significant ways to helping alleviate the crunch that these cities and areas are experiencing. This is what I'm talking about that's being caused frictions in communities like border cities, Eagle Pass, El Paso, Chicago, and New York as well. While these cities are striving for greater equity, they're having to take money out of their budgets to receive and welcome and provide humanitarian assistance and integration to these migrants. So additional funding would help, but at the same time, enacting immigration reform is a part of that process because the broken immigration system is being manipulated by cartels, by gangs, by other mafias throughout all of the countries where migrants are traversing, and people are being manipulated and misled into thinking that if they simply get to the border, that things are going to be great. They're going to be able to get assistance and jobs and integrated into society. This is the type of disinformation and misinformation that's being manipulated by forces that are behind a lot of the human tragedy and trafficking that's taking place, given the current set of events and our inability in Congress to enact immigration reform.
Congressman, you mentioned cartels and their role in this, but we've had at least a couple of the Republican candidates for president, Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida and Nikki Haley, the former UN ambassador, who've actually voiced support for sending troops or firing missiles into Mexico, supposedly to battle these cartels. DeSantis has gone as far as to say he'd consider using drone strikes. Your response to this kind of language and how this affects the debate?
This is further Republican devolution of talking points. You know, just a few years ago, it was only Donald Trump that was saying these outrageous things. Now it's most of the front runners or those seeking to become front runners in the Republican primary that are saying these terrible, irresponsible things. That's why I introduced an amendment in the appropriations process that would, reiterate Congress's War Powers Act and to ensure that we adhere to what the Constitution and those powers that only Congress has are adhered to. And two, I wanted to, through that amendment, return us to take a long look at our history of intervention and sanctions and the failed war on drugs, many of the factors that are contributing to migrants coming to this country in desperation. In other words, things that we've done for many decades in Central America and in South America are now coming home as part of our failed foreign policy toward those countries. That's why I introduced that amendment, because I wanted there to be a real conversation about what is responsible and what is sustainable into the future. It is ridiculous to think that we would be considering seriously launching missiles into Mexico, violating their sovereignty, and of course ruining a relationship that is special and that should be rooted in collaboration and mutual understanding and of course respect with Mexico. These are the types of MAGA Republicans that are also behind wanting to shut down the government, to hold the nation hostage, to enact crazy, radical proposals like returning to building the wall, doubling down on the amount of detention and cruel enforcement at the border that could result in the separation of families, which was a part of the Trump policy, and of course continuing to dismantle the asylum system and defunding the ability to provide legal counsel to those seeking political asylum in our country.
Congressmember Garcia, you make this key point about U.S. foreign policy. While you have that Eagle Pass mayor saying people are coming here without consequence, I mean, my gosh, the grueling route that they take over many months, the number of people injured and who die, when they talk about them putting it on the migrants around without consequence, as opposed to the United States and the issue of the United States foreign policy and recognizing how it's driving people here. Your final thoughts on this immigration discussion as we move into National Hispanic Heritage Month?
So desperation is something that is driving people to come to our southern border. And let's not forget our responsibility in things that we did decades ago, a few years ago, that is producing this. The latest has been the sanctions against Venezuela, which has shattered the economy, forced people to flee to Colombia and some of the other nearby countries, and ultimately they've decided to risk their lives, to risk everything, crossing the Darien Gap, and again being subjected to all of the trials and tribulations of cartels and mafias and corrupt government officials as they traverse in their dangerous journey through all the countries in Central America and Mexico. This will not cease until we begin to work multilaterally with the sending countries, until we decide to change our past interventionist policies, as well as the sanctions that we have inflicted on many countries. This is at the root of things. We need to work with countries in Central America and in South America. There are progressive governments there that are willing to do this. Until we treat immigration at the root where the conditions are displacing people and forcing people to flee, we're going to continue to experience these things. These are similar to developments going on in Europe as well, where people are fleeing. When you add climate change and the degradation of the conditions in these countries, they will only force more people to be displaced as they seek refuge, asylum, and greater security. So until we take a more comprehensive approach to dealing with the root causes, we're going to experience these types of crises.
Congressmember Garcia, we want to ask you to stay with us there in the Capitol Rotunda for a minute. I want to say goodbye to Fernando Garcia, head of the Border Network for Human Rights, speaking to us from El Paso. As we stay with Congressmember Garcia, we're continuing our coverage related to National Hispanic Heritage Month, which goes from September 15th to October 15th. September 15th, the date that marks the anniversary of independence for Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. Mexico celebrates its Independence Day on September 16th, Chile on September 18th. Well, this past June marked the 40th anniversary of what many call the assassination of a leading Chicago labor and community activist, Rudy Lozano, who was Congressmember Garcia's friend and political mentor. Starting in the 60s, Rudy Lozano led walkouts to demand better public school conditions, more Latinx representation in the curriculum, also active with the Center for Autonomous Social Action, known as CASA, to organize migrant workers. Rudy Lozano was Midwest director of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, played a key role in building black-brown unity to elect Harold Washington as Chicago's first African-American mayor. Tragically, he was shot dead in his own home in 1983 when he was just 31 years old. So this past June, Chicago Congressmember Chuy Garcia, our guest, honored Rudy Lozano's life and legacy in a speech on the House floor.
I rise today to honor a great organizer and community activist, a leader who fought the Chicago machine and built multiracial and intergenerational coalitions, my friend, political mentor, and compadre, Rudy Lozano. A labor organizer, he fought for workers' rights. As a community activist, he fought for justice for immigrant families. Rudy brought together diverse communities to elect Harold Washington, Chicago's first black mayor, in 1983. Rudy knew political empowerment was vital to improving community conditions. My presence in Congress and the growing number of progressive Black, Latino, and Asian American elected officials in Chicagoland represents the enduring impact of his legacy. Let's continue his legacy by working in coalition to ensure a more inclusive politics for all. Que viva Rudy Lozano.
That was Congressman Jesus Chuy Garcia talking in Congress about the legacy of Rudy Lozano. Congressman, if you could talk about your friend and your fellow activist in Chicago, his importance, the role of CASA, and why that legacy needs to be remembered.
So Rudy Lozano is a product of movements in the U.S. and certainly in Chicago. He was forged during the civil rights movement, during the movement opposing the unjust war in Vietnam, during the time when the Black Panthers were making a significant impact in the black community. Brown Berets were organizing for dignity and justice in the Southwest. Those movements were also present in Chicago through the Brown Berets and movements to improve our schools, movements that said our immigration system is broken and we need immigration reform in Washington. People should have a pathway to citizenship. Workers need to be organized so that they can bargain at the table and improve their working conditions, earn better wages, provide for their families, be able to retire. Things that are going on in our midst as we do this interview. We celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month in Chicago, commemorating and lifting up the contributions of activists like Rudy Lozano who were responsible for movements that have empowered Latino, African American, Asian, and other discriminated communities over a 40-year span. In Chicago, the organization that Rudy helped found, he was our founding president, continues to be